The stone wall cracked like a gunshot in the silence of the sheriff's office, and Sarah Ellsworth stood with her chisel pressed against the limestone facade, her jaw set so tight that the muscles along her cheekbones had gone white. Behind her, Sheriff Oliver Maddox had his hand around her wrist. Not rough, not cruel, but firm enough that she could feel every callus on his palm, every year of hard frontier living pressed into her skin like a brand. "I said open it," he growled, his voice low and dangerous in the way that men who were genuinely dangerous always spoke, without theater, without performance. "3 men are going to hang by morning if you don't." "And if I open it," Sarah said, not turning around, "then the man who built this passage gets everything he ever wanted. Every secret he buried in there comes pouring out like water from a busted dam, and not all of those secrets belong to outlaws, Sheriff. Some of them belong to people you swore to protect." The grip on her wrist loosened just slightly, but she felt it, that hesitation. That was the crack in the foundation, and Sarah Ellsworth knew cracks better than anyone alive in Redemption Creek, Wyoming territory, in the year of our Lord 1881. "Tell me what's in there," Oliver said, and for the first time since she had met him 6 weeks ago, there was something in his voice that was not command. It was closer to plea, and it cost him something to speak it. She could hear that clearly. "Tell me what we're walking into." Sarah finally turned, and the lantern light caught the dust on her cheekbones and the iron in her dark eyes. She was 31 years old, built lean and strong from years of hauling sandstone blocks and mixing mortar in the mountain sun, and she looked at Oliver Maddox the way she looked at a wall that needed assessing. She was measuring the load-bearing truth of him. "You want the truth," she said quietly. "I've wanted nothing else since I rode into this town," he answered. And that, Sarah thought, was probably the most honest thing anyone had said in Redemption Creek in a very long time. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone, feeling the subtle vibration of the hidden mechanism beneath, and she made her decision. But to understand why that decision meant everything, you had to go back to the beginning. 6 weeks earlier, when a sheriff with haunted gray eyes and a reputation that traveled faster than he did rode into Redemption Creek on a black horse named Consequence, and found that the woman he needed to talk to was standing on a scaffold 16 feet above the street, laying stones with the precision of a surgeon. Redemption Creek had been carved out of the Wyoming mountain foothills in 1874, which made it 7 years old and already looking like it had been standing for 50. The altitude did that to things. The wind stripped paint from storefronts before it had a chance to dry, and the sun bleached wood gray in a single summer. The town had the particular quality of frontier settlements that knew they might not survive their next decade, a barely contained urgency in the way buildings pressed against each other, in the way people moved through the packed dirt streets with their eyes already scanning the horizon for the next trouble. The trouble, that October, had a name. 3 names, actually. The Callow brothers, Hector, Doyle, and young Ramai, had robbed the Union Pacific Freight Office in Cheyenne of $14,000 in government payroll, killed 2 federal marshals in the process, and disappeared into the mountain territories with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they had help. Serious help. The kind that only came from people who knew the land, who knew which passes were watched and which were not, who knew where to find shelter that no posse could locate. Oliver Maddox had been tracking them for 6 weeks through 3 territories when the trail led him to Redemption Creek. He was 35, a United States deputy marshal out of Denver, though he carried the title of sheriff because most frontier towns had lost their local lawmen to bullets or better opportunities, and were grateful to deputize any federal officer who passed through. He had a reputation for being relentless, for not stopping once he started, and for a particular brand of quiet that men learned to fear the same way they feared still water over a deep hole. He rode in on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing he noticed was the scaffold. The second thing he noticed was the woman on it. She was working on the new bank building. the first proper stone bank Redemption Creek had ever had, commissioned by a man named Gerald Holt, who had made himself rich through methods that were technically legal and thoroughly ruthless. The bank was being built in the Italianate style that was fashionable in eastern cities, with carved limestone details around the arched windows, and someone up on that scaffold was doing work that Oliver had never seen outside of a picture book. Delicate, exact, stone cut so cleanly that the joints looked like pencil lines. He stopped his horse. He genuinely stopped his horse in the middle of the street and looked up. The woman did not look down. She was measuring something with a folding rule, checking it twice, making a small chalk mark, and then picking up a chisel that she handled the way Oliver handled a firearm, like an extension of her own hand. "You going to stare all morning or move your animal out of the street?" called a gruff voice from the hardware store doorway to his left. Oliver shifted in the saddle and looked at the old man lounging there. "Who is she?" The old man, who turned out to be Emmett Briggs and who ran the hardware store, squinted up at the scaffold with the comfortable pride of a man who felt some proprietary satisfaction in the local wonders. "That's Sarah Ellsworth, best stonemason between Denver and Boise, some say. Come out from Pittsburgh 5 years ago with her father's toolbox and a commission letter, built half the permanent structures in this county. She's the only stonemason in town." "She's the only stonemason for 60 miles, Emmett said. "And trust me, Mr. Whatever your name is, she knows it. Don't go trying to push her around. She'll set you straight faster than a plumb line." Oliver filed that information away the way he filed all information, quietly and precisely, and rode on to find the man he had actually come to see, a man named Gerald Holt. Holt was not what Oliver expected. He was 53. With a banker's soft hands and a politician's soft smile, and the kind of eyes that were always calculating, something 3 conversations ahead of the one you were actually having. He received Oliver in the back office of his temporary working quarters, a converted saloon room that smelled of cheap tobacco and expensive ambition, and he was gracious in a way that made every hair on Oliver's neck stand up. "Deputy Marshal Maddox," Holt said, extending a hand. "I've heard of you. You caught the Perez gang last spring, if I'm remembering right. Fine work." "The Callow brothers," Oliver said, getting directly to the point. "Their trail ends here. I need to know if anyone in this town has had contact with them." Holt spread his soft hands on the desk. "I run a bank, Marshal. I'm afraid outlaws don't typically announce themselves to bankers. The money they took was federal payroll. Those marshals they killed had families. Oliver let that sit in the air between them. I'll be talking to everyone in town." "Of course," Holt said pleasantly. "I'll do anything I can to assist." Oliver thanked him and left, and he spent the rest of that day and the next 2 doing exactly what he said, talking to everyone. He talked to Emmett at the hardware store, to Doc Pemberton, to Mayor Asa Crow, who was nervous in an unremarkable way, to the saloon keeper, to the reverend, to the woman at the dry goods store. He built his map of Redemption Creek the way Sarah Ellsworth built her walls, 1 stone at a time, checking each piece for weight and fit before placing it. He ran into Sarah Ellsworth again on Thursday morning. She was at the lumberyard, of all places, studying a delivery of sandstone blocks that had just come in on a freight wagon from the quarry outside of town. She was arguing with the freight driver in a calm, clear voice that carried the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "These are not second-grade blocks," she was saying, holding a chunk of sandstone up to the morning light and running her thumb along the grain. "Look at the bedding planes. This was cut against the grain. It'll spall within 2 winters. I ordered first-grade blocks cut parallel to the natural bed, and whoever at the quarry decided to fill my order with this is going to answer to me directly." The freight driver, a big man with a sunburned neck, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I just haul what they load." "I know you do," Sarah said, not unkindly. "I'm not blaming you. I'm telling you to take it back." "I can't take it back. The quarry's 40 miles out." "Then I'll be writing to their foreman tonight, and he can arrange collection at his own expense." She set the block down with a decisive thud. I won't use inferior stone on a building where people are going to keep their money. That's not the kind of work I do. Oliver had stopped near the fence of the lumberyard without intending to, drawn by the conversation the way you were drawn by competence when you saw it in unexpected places. Sarah turned then and saw him watching, and she did not look embarrassed or startled. She looked at him with an assessing directness that he found immediately unsettling. "You're the deputy marshal," she said. It was not a question. "Oliver Maddox," he said, walking forward and extending his hand the way he would to any professional. She shook it with a grip that surprised him, dry and firm, her palm rough from work. "Sarah Ellsworth, I heard you've been asking questions around town." "I have." "Then you'll want to ask me some," she said simply. "I've been building on and around Gerald Holt's property for 2 months. I've seen things." That was how it began. They walked along the creek that ran behind the main street, the October cottonwoods shaking gold into the cold water, and Sarah told him what she had observed with the same precision she applied to everything. Gerald Holt had commissioned not only the bank but a series of modifications to his personal residence at the edge of town, modifications that Sarah had been hired to execute. She described them in technical terms that Oliver largely followed because he was a good listener, and because the shapes of what she described told their own story. He wanted a second cellar, she said, underneath the existing one, access through the west wall of the first cellar, through what looks like a standard storage alcove. But the alcove has a mechanism, a trigger stone, that releases a counterweight and swings a section of wall open on a pivot. I designed it to his specifications and I built it so I know every part of it. Oliver had gone very still. "A hidden passage." "A tunnel, actually," Sarah said, and her voice was controlled, but he could hear the unease beneath it, the thing she had been sitting with alone for too long. "It connects the bank cellar to the residence cellar. They're about 40 yards apart. He told me it was for moving valuables securely without crossing the street. At the time, I believed him. At the time, I thought Gerald Holt was simply a wealthy man being cautious. And now," she stopped walking and turned to face the creek, "now I've been watching. And I've seen men go in and out of that residence at hours when no legitimate business is being conducted. Men I don't recognize. Men who have the look of people who don't want to be recognized." Oliver watched the side of her face, the clean, strong line of her jaw, the way she frowned when she was thinking, a small vertical line between her brows that he recognized as the mark of someone who took the world seriously enough to actually worry about it. "You should have come forward sooner," he said, and he said it gently, not as an accusation. "To whom?" she asked, and there was something sharp in it, not anger at him but at the situation. "The previous sheriff, before he resigned last spring, was friends with Holt. The mayor is afraid of Holt. I have no husband, no family connections here, no social protections. I'm a woman running a business in a town that still isn't entirely comfortable with the concept. If I had made accusations against the most powerful man in Redemption Creek with no proof, what do you think would have happened?" Oliver thought about it honestly. "Your contracts would have disappeared." "My contracts would have disappeared," she confirmed. "And I would have had to leave, which means leaving behind 5 years of work, 5 years of building something real in a place I chose to build it." She finally looked at him. "I'm not a coward, Marshal, I'm a realist." "I can see the difference," Oliver said, and meant it. She searched his face for a moment, checking him the way she checked her stone, looking for flaws in the structure, and apparently she found the load-bearing he was offering to be sound enough because she nodded. "There's something else," she said. 3 weeks ago, when I was finishing the interior work on the bank cellar, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. In the passage itself, on the Holt residence side, there's a secondary chamber. It's not on any plans I was given. Someone dug it out after I'd finished and shored it with timber amateur work. It'll rot in 10 years, but it was functional enough for the short term. I looked inside." "What did you find?" "Crates," Sarah said. "Government stamp crates. I didn't open them, but the stamps were military supply markings, the kind used for payroll transport." the silence between them filled with the sound of the creak and the distant knock of hammers from the building site. "That's where the callow money is," Oliver said. "That's where I believe the money is," Sarah said carefully. "I'm a stonemason, not a federal officer, but yes." Oliver stood there for a moment, processing the gift of what she had just given him, the extraordinary gift of someone who had taken a serious personal risk to do what was right the moment she had a trustworthy person to tell it to. He felt a deep, clean gratitude that was almost painful. "Will you show me the trigger?" he asked. "The mechanism that opens the passage." And that was where the complication began, because Sarah said, "That depends on what you plan to do with it." She would not simply hand over her knowledge. She explained it in measured terms over the following hour, walking with him back toward the center of town. She had built that passage. She had designed the mechanism with her own expertise. If Oliver went to a judge for a warrant and Holt got wind of it, Holt would destroy the evidence in that chamber within 24 hours, and the Callow brothers would walk free. More than that, Holt himself would walk free, because everything Sarah knew was circumstantial until those crates were found. "What I'm proposing," Sarah said, stopping in front of the nearly finished bank building and looking up at her own work with an expression Oliver was learning to read as professional pride held carefully in check, "is that I open the passage myself, with you present, under circumstances where Holt cannot get advance warning. We go to the chamber together, we document what's there, and then you make your arrests with evidence in hand." "That's not how this is supposed to work," Oliver said. "Tell me how it's supposed to work then," she said pleasantly, "and I'll tell you which part of the plan will allow Gerald Holt to escape justice." Oliver opened his mouth, closed it. He was not a man who was easily outmaneuvered, and the experience of being outmaneuvered by a woman with mortar dust on her sleeves was sufficiently novel that for a moment he simply stood there recalibrating. "You've thought about this for a while," he said finally. "Since the day I found those crates," she said. 3 weeks. I needed someone I could trust." She looked at him directly again, and there was something vulnerable in that directness, something it took courage to offer. "I'm not certain you are that person yet, but you're the most promising candidate I've seen." Something in Oliver Maddox's chest shifted in a way that had nothing to do with professional respect. They spent the next 2 weeks building a case. Not openly, not in ways that would alert Holt, but carefully in the spaces between ordinary interaction. Oliver continued his visible investigation into the Callow brothers, asking around about strangers and travel routes, maintaining the appearance of a man who was making no particular progress. Sarah continued her work on the bank, finishing the exterior stone details with the same precise patience she applied to everything. But in the evenings, Oliver began finding reasons to stop by the building site after the other workers had left, ostensibly to check on progress for some municipal reason that neither of them bothered making entirely convincing. And Sarah began being there, not because she needed the extra hours, but because she needed to talk through what they were building, not the bank, but the case, the architecture of a legal trap that would hold. She taught him things during those evenings that he hadn't expected to learn. Not about stonework, though she talked about that too, in ways that turned out to be unexpectedly fascinating, but about attention. About the way a trained eye noticed what an untrained eye passed over. About patience as a form of intelligence, the willingness to observe longer than felt comfortable, to resist the urge to move before the picture was complete. "You're doing it right now," she said one evening 3 weeks in when they were standing in the cooling shadow of the bank's east wall, and he was watching a rider at the far end of the street with carefully casual attention. "Doing what?" he said. "Watching without looking like you're watching," she said. "That's a skill. Most people can't do it." "You can," he said. She smiled, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the controlled, professional expression she wore like armor, but something warmer, quicker, like light bouncing off moving water. It was gone almost immediately, but he carried it with him afterward the way you carry warmth from a good fire even after you've stepped outside. My father taught me, she said. He was a stonemason too. He said that the most important part of building anything was looking at it long enough to understand what it actually was, not what you assumed it was, not what you wanted it to be. The stone tells you what it wants to become if you watch it long enough. Is that why you came west? Oliver asked. To find what you wanted to become. She was quiet for a moment. I came west because a man in Pittsburgh decided I couldn't possibly know what I was talking about, despite being taught by one of the finest masons in Pennsylvania, despite completing dozens of commissions, despite having letters of reference that any male mason would have killed for. He gave the commission I'd won to someone half as qualified and twice as well connected, and I decided that if I was going to fight for every foot of ground I stood on, I might as well fight for ground that was genuinely worth something. The frontier, Oliver said. The frontier, she agreed, with a wry twist to her mouth. Which is not the meritocracy they advertise in the Eastern papers, I'll tell you that. But it's closer. You can build things here that actually stand. People look at what you've done, and they have to admit it holds. Oliver thought about his own reasons for heading west after the war, for choosing a badge and a horse and an endless horizon over the enclosed, layered complications of the cities where he'd grown up. He had his own version of that need, he realized. The need for ground that told the truth about what you built on it. You never married, he asked, and then immediately wondered if he'd overstepped. Sarah gave him a sideways look that held gentle amusement rather than offense. I never found anyone who was comfortable with the fact that I'm very good at something, she said. Men in my experience want to help. They want to be useful and capable and reassuring. When you're already capable of reassuring yourself, it makes them uncomfortable. Or, Oliver said carefully, it makes them curious. She looked at him again, and this time the look was different. Measuring again, but measuring something other than competence. The air between them had been changing gradually, the way the light changed in the late afternoon, so slowly you couldn't identify the exact moment it shifted, only suddenly noticed that everything looked different than it had. The case, meanwhile, was developing. Oliver had sent coded dispatches to the federal office in Denver, documenting what Sarah had told him and laying out the plan. He'd gotten cautious encouragement back, a reminder that his evidence needed to be solid, that a man of Holt's resources would hire lawyers who would attack any procedural weakness, and that he needed to move carefully. He also, through patient conversation and observation, confirmed that the Callow brothers were indeed in the area. He spotted Hector Callow at the saloon one night, thinner than his wanted poster but unmistakable by the scar that ran from his right ear to his chin. He didn't move on the man immediately, partly because he was alone and 3-to-1 odds in a saloon full of Holt's paid allies was poor strategy, and partly because he needed to trace the full network before he pulled any thread. Pull one thread too early and the whole web disappears. He told Sarah about seeing Hector Callow. They were eating supper at the boarding house where Oliver was staying, which had started as a practical arrangement since it was the easiest place to talk privately, and had over 3 weeks acquired the comfortable quality of something else entirely, of something anticipated. Mrs. Calloway, who ran the boarding house, had begun setting 2 plates at the corner table without being asked, with the serene unsurprise of a woman who had seen many things. So they're definitely here, Sarah said, her fork resting on her plate. She was not frightened, he noted. She was thinking. Here and protected, Oliver said, which means Holt is their contact. He's not just storing their money, he's providing them cover. He's been moving men through that tunnel, Sarah said. That's what I've been seeing. They go in through the residence and come out through the bank, or vice versa, at night. If he's moving the Callow brothers through town, using my passage to keep them invisible, she paused, and her jaw tightened with a controlled anger that Oliver found more striking than any theatrical fury would have been, then he used my work to help murderers hide. He used a tool, Oliver said. You couldn't have known. I should have been more careful about who I sold my tools to, she said quietly. You came to me, he said. The moment you had someone to trust, you came forward. That's not something to fault yourself for. She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight did something to her face that made it hard for him to look away, made it harder than usual, which was already harder than it had any professional reason to be. "I want to be there when you open it," she said. "Not just to operate the trigger, I want to be there. It could be dangerous." "Yes," she agreed. "I can't promise it won't be." "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm asking to be present at the reckoning for something I built. I think I've earned that." Oliver thought about arguing. He thought about the federal protocols that would have been clear on the subject of keeping civilians back. He thought about all the sensible reasons a woman should not be present at the arrest of 3 wanted killers in a dark underground passage. Then he thought about what she'd said in the lumberyard on the second day. To whom would she have gone? He thought about the 5 years of building, the fight for every foot of ground, the way she held her chisel like an extension of her will. "You'll stay behind me," he said. "Agreed," she said immediately, which told him she'd already thought through the tactical arrangement and reached the same conclusion independently. The plan crystallized over the following week. Oliver had received word from Denver that 2 additional deputy marshals would be arriving by the end of the month, but the end of the month was 12 days away, and the intelligence he was gathering suggested that Holt was planning to move the Callow brothers out of the area within the week. The money, or at least a portion of it, was likely being moved at the same time. He couldn't wait for reinforcements. He could, however, move carefully. The night before they planned to act, Oliver and Sarah sat in the boarding house common room long after the other guests had retired, the fire burning low and the wind coming off the mountains pressing against the windows. They had spread a hand-drawn map of the bank cellar and tunnel between them on the table, Sarah's drawing, done from memory with the kind of precise spatial recall that Oliver found quietly extraordinary. She walked him through it again. The bank cellar, accessible through a locked trapdoor behind the teller counter, which he could open with the master key that Holt had been legally required to provide upon granting permission for the building inspection, another thing Sarah had thought through. Then down through the cellar, to the west wall and the storage alcove that looked like nothing. "The trigger stone is the 3rd stone from the left in the 2nd course from the floor," she said, pointing to the diagram. "It doesn't move much, just about a 1/4-inch depression. There's a spring mechanism behind it, compressed limestone and iron, that releases the counterweight when you apply the right pressure in the right direction." "Show me," Oliver said. She placed her finger on the diagram. "Down and slightly to the left. Not just down. The angle is important. If you push straight down, it doesn't engage. I designed it that way deliberately so that someone who found the alcove by accident wouldn't open it by leaning against the wall." Oliver studied her face in the firelight. "You designed it with security in mind, even while you were building it for Holt." "Old habit," she said. "I always design for the mechanism's integrity regardless of who commissions it. A hidden passage should actually stay hidden until deliberately opened. That's just good craft." "Your craft saved us," he said. "If the passage had been easy to find, Holt's men would have found us before we found them." She looked up from the diagram and their eyes met across the hand-drawn map. Oliver had a very clear awareness of the distance between them, about 18 inches, and an equally clear awareness that 18 inches was both a reasonable professional distance and an entirely inadequate amount of space for what he was actually feeling. "Be careful tomorrow," she said, and the professional coat she wore around herself was thinner than usual, worn soft by the hour and the firelight, and possibly by 3 weeks of building something together that was not made of stone. "You be careful," he said. "You're the one who knows how to open it. That makes you the most important person in that cellar." "Then maybe you should stay behind me," she said, and the edge of humor in it was delicate, but it was there. "Maybe I should," he said, and let the moment be what it was. They were quiet for a while, the fire settling. Oliver thought about how the plan would unfold, going through contingencies in the methodical way he always did. He thought about what he knew of the Callows, their violence, their willingness to kill. He thought about Sarah behind him in a dark tunnel. "Tell me something," he said, not quite knowing what he was going to say until he said it. "If this goes wrong, If something happens in that passage, is there anyone I should contact? It was a practical question. It was also not a practical question. My father's sister in Philadelphia, Sarah said quietly. My tools and my ledgers go to a young man named Thomas Reyes who's been apprenticing with me. He's gifted. He deserves a chance. She paused. You. My brother in Colorado Springs, Oliver said. He knows what to do. They looked at each other, and the weight of it, of being people who had made provision for their own deaths because that was simply the world they moved through, was something shared without needing to be said. It's not going to go wrong, Sarah said, with a firmness that was partly conviction and partly will. No, Oliver agreed with the same mixture. He almost reached across the table. He was aware of almost doing it, aware of his hand being still on the map between them, and aware of the effort it took to leave it there. There was a time for things, and it was not now, in the night before an operation that required both of them to have every piece of their attention in exactly the right place. But he looked at her, long enough and directly enough that it said what his hand did not. She looked back and her eyes were very clear and very dark, and she did not look away. "Good night, Marshal," she said, rising and folding the map with neat precision. "Good night, Sarah," he said, and the name in his mouth felt like a stone fitted perfectly into place. The next morning came up cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming October morning that was beautiful in the way of things that could kill you, the air crystalline and the mountains sharp-edged against a sky so blue it looked painted. Oliver was awake before dawn, running through the plan one more time, checking his Colt revolver with the mechanical thoroughness of long habit, loading it with the 6 rounds he'd selected the night before, the good brass-cased cartridges without the slight imperfections that could cause a misfire. He met Sarah at the edge of the alley behind the bank at 6 in the morning. The town was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sound of someone splitting wood. Sarah had her tool bag with her, the heavy canvas roll she carried to every worksite, and she was dressed in her working clothes, a heavy canvas jacket and trousers that she wore for practical reasons she had explained to Oliver early on, and which Redemption Creek had eventually accepted as simply how Sarah Ellsworth dressed when she was working. "Holt usually doesn't come to the bank until 9, she said by way of greeting. "That gives us 3 hours, Oliver said. "More than enough." They entered through the bank's back door using Oliver's inspection authority, which gave him legal right of access to the building, a detail he'd been careful to establish formally, and in writing with Mayor Crow 2 weeks ago, leaving no procedural vulnerability for a defense attorney to exploit later. The bank interior was dim and cold, smelling of fresh plaster and new wood, and the particular mineral scent of cut limestone that Oliver had come to associate specifically with Sarah. The trapdoor behind the teller counter was heavy, iron-banded oak, and it opened with the key without protest. Below was a steep wooden stair descending into darkness. Oliver lit the lantern he'd brought and they went down. The bank cellar was larger than Oliver had expected, solidly built, the stone walls exactly as precise as the work he'd seen on the exterior. Sarah had done this. He looked at it and thought about that, about what it meant to have your skill used against your intentions, and felt for her the particular anger of a craftsperson whose craft has been stolen. They crossed to the west wall. The storage alcove was exactly as she described it, a recessed area about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, lined with shelves that held a few old building materials, nothing that would attract attention. "Third from the left, second course from the floor," Oliver murmured. "Yes," Sarah said, coming forward past him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm and crouching to the right height. Her hand moved to the stone with the confidence of intimate knowledge, fingers settling on a block that looked identical to every other block in the wall. She pressed, down and slightly to the left. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a sound like a held breath being released, something deep in the wall moved. A mechanical complexity that Oliver could only half imagine. Springs and counterweights and pivots that Sarah had designed and placed with her own hands, engaging in sequence. The section of wall, the full width of the alcove back, swung inward on a vertical pivot, smooth and nearly silent. Beyond was darkness and the smell of earth and something else, something metallic and closed, the smell of hidden things. Oliver looked at Sarah. She was looking at her own work with an expression that was extraordinarily complex, pride and violation and grief and something that looked like resolution, all present simultaneously in the clear, strong lines of her face. "Straight ahead," she said. "About 40 yards. The secondary chamber is on the right side, shored with timber. You'll see it." "Behind me," Oliver said. "Behind you," she confirmed. He went in first with the lantern raised, his right hand free and near his holster. The tunnel was 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, enough to move through without crouching badly but not enough to be comfortable. The stone walls gave way to packed earth and timber shoring after about 20 feet, where the tunnel passed out from under the bank's stone foundation and into the natural ground between the buildings. He heard voices. He stopped. Sarah stopped immediately behind him. They stood motionless in the dark. The voices were ahead and to the right, muffled by earth but close. 2 voices, maybe 3. Oliver couldn't make out words, but he could hear the cadences of conversation. Not alarm, just talk. He turned and put his mouth very close to Sarah's ear, close enough to smell the clean, cold air that had come in with her from outside. "People in the chamber," he breathed. She nodded, her hair brushing his cheek. He moved forward again, slower now, placing each step with care. The lantern was a risk, it announced them, but the darkness without it was too complete to navigate safely. He compromised, turning the lantern's shutter so it threw only a narrow blade of light forward. The secondary chamber entrance appeared on his right exactly where Sarah had described it, a gap in the timber shoring with a rough-cut board door propped against its frame. Light spilled from around the door's edges. The voices were behind it. Oliver exhaled, composed himself. He thought about the 2 murdered federal marshals, about the stolen payroll meant for soldiers and their families, about Gerald Holt's soft hands and calculating eyes. He put his shoulder against the door and went through. 3 men. Hector Callow was the one he recognized. The scar, the lean predatory build, sitting on a crate that Oliver was nearly certain was government-marked. Doyle Callow, the middle brother, was the big one, heavy-set, hands that could break things, rising from his seated position with an expression that had no surprise in it, only a professional assessment of the situation. And the third, young Remai Callow, barely older than a boy, 19 or 20, who had the look of someone who had been frightened so long that it had become his normal expression. 6 government-marked crates were stacked along the chamber wall. "United States Marshal," Oliver said, keeping his voice level and his gun not yet drawn. "Hands where I can see them, all of you." Doyle Callow moved. Oliver drew and fired before the larger man's hand reached the gun at his hip, placing the shot exactly where it needed to go, into Doyle's gun hand, controlled, precise, non-lethal. Doyle went down swearing. Hector Callow froze with the specific intelligence of a man who had just watched his brother get shot by someone who could clearly shoot better than he could. Young Remai went very still against the wall. "Hector," Oliver said calmly, "hands up and we all walk out of here. How did you find this?" Hector asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in it. "The same way you find anything," Oliver said. "You ask the right person." He was aware of Sarah in the doorway behind him, steady, present, exactly where she'd said she'd be. He was aware of it the way you were aware of a sound structural wall behind you, as a certainty. Hector Callow put his hands up. The arrests were made. Doyle's hand wound bound with cloth from Oliver's saddlebag. The 3 brothers secured with the iron cuffs Oliver had been carrying since Denver, and the evidence documented by the numbered inventory that Oliver completed in that underground chamber with Sarah, holding the second lantern, and recording each crate's markings in the notebook he produced from his coat. Getting them up and out through the tunnel, and into the dawn light behind the bank, was a logistical exercise that Oliver managed with a cold efficiency that he could feel Sarah watching and cataloging in that observational way of hers. The Callow brothers went ahead with Oliver's gun at their backs. Doyle, helped along by his brother Remai, who was young enough and frightened enough to cooperate fully. They emerged into the cold morning air behind the bank to find that Gerald Holt was standing at the far end of the alley. He was not alone. He had two men with him, large men who had the look of hired muscle, and he was impeccably dressed for 9 in the morning as though he had been expecting company. His face had none of its usual pleasant calculation. It was stripped down to something harder and plainer. "Marshal Maddox," he said, "I see you found my storage facility." "Gerald Holt," Oliver said, moving the gallows to one side against the wall where he could cover both the brothers and Holt's men. "You're under arrest. Federal charges, accessory to robbery and murder of federal officers, obstruction, receiving stolen government property." "That's quite a list," Holt said. "Pity there's only one of you." "Two," Sarah said, stepping out of the tunnel entrance behind Oliver. Holt's eyes moved to her and something crossed his face that was uglier than anything Oliver had seen from him yet. Not surprise, recognition, and the special anger of a man who had been betrayed by someone he considered beneath his notice. "You built my passage," he said, and his voice had gone quiet with a fury he was keeping barely contained. "I paid you well." "You paid me to build," Sarah said, and her voice was calm and her hands were steady. "You didn't pay me to be silent about murder." "I could ruin you," Holt said, "in this territory and every territory adjacent. One letter from me and you'll never receive another commission. I know everyone who matters." "Everyone who mattered to you, maybe," Sarah said. "Most of them are about to learn how well your judgment can be trusted." Holt moved his eyes to his hired men and gave them the small nod that was all they needed. Oliver shot the nearer man's gun out of his hand, a shot that was somewhere between extraordinary and outright remarkable given the angle, and the far man reconsidered his options in the microsecond of shocked silence that followed and raised his hands instead. It was over. Gerald Holt, in the end, came quietly. There was something in him, Oliver observed, that recognized completed business. He had played and lost, and he was smart enough to know when to stop playing. The aftermath was thorough and consuming. Oliver's 2 deputy reinforcements arrived from Denver 2 days later, and with them, a federal prosecutor who was very interested in the government crates and deeply satisfied with the evidence chain that Oliver had constructed. The criminal case against Holt was, in the federal prosecutor's precise words, exceptionally clean, which Oliver received as the professional compliment it was while privately crediting a significant portion of it to the 3 weeks of careful preparation he had done with Sarah. Holt was transported to Cheyenne to await trial. The Callow brothers were transported separately, Doyle to the Territorial Prison Hospital, Hector and Remai to the county jail. Young Remai, in the end, cooperated so fully with the prosecutor that his sentence was substantially reduced, and Oliver found he could not entirely begrudge the boy that. He had been the least of the 3 in every sense. The stolen government payroll was recovered almost entirely intact, the crates having been opened and counted but not yet significantly distributed. The federal marshals' families would receive the compensation that had been intended for them. That was the part that mattered most, and Oliver said so in his formal report. The day after the federal officers departed with their prisoners, Oliver found Sarah at the bank building. The exterior was nearly complete, the last limestone blocks going up on the decorative cornice, and she was back on her scaffold in the morning sun, but she wasn't working. She was sitting on the scaffold platform with her legs hanging over the edge and her face turned up toward the clear sky, and there was something in her posture that was not her usual contained purposefulness. It was more like someone letting go of a held breath. He climbed the scaffold ladder without announcing himself, which was slightly irresponsible given that scaffold ladders should not be ascended without warning the person above, but she heard him anyway and turned to watch him come up. He settled beside her on the platform, their legs hanging over the edge above 16 feet of morning air. The town spread below them, small and dusty and real, the creek shining at its back edge, the mountains enormous and blue-white behind everything. "How are you?" he asked. "Honest answer or comfortable answer," she said. "Honest," she considered. "Unsettled," she said finally. "I built something with my hands and my mind, and it was used for things that were wrong, and even though it's been corrected, I can still feel the wrongness of it, like a badly laid stone. You can correct a bad course, but you always know it was wrong." "The passage is still there," Oliver said. "The passage is still there," she agreed. "It'll need to be removed. I expect the new bank management will want it sealed." "Will you do it?" "Yes," she said. "I'll seal it myself. Fill it in properly, replace the alcove wall with solid stone, make it right." She paused. "It's good work, actually. There's something satisfying about that kind of correction." They sat in the autumn sun, and the town moved below them, and Oliver thought about a number of things, about Denver and his next posting, about the report he still needed to finalize, about his brother in Colorado Springs, and about the fact that he had never in his professional life sat on a scaffold with a stonemason and found himself profoundly unwilling to be anywhere else. "I'll be leaving soon," he said. Sarah said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know. My work here is finished." "I know that too." He turned to look at her profile, the clean angle of her nose, the way the sunlight found the dust in her dark hair. "What if it didn't have to be finished?" he said, and the straightforwardness of it was deliberate because she had made clear, both by what she said and how she lived, that she had no patience for indirection. Sarah turned her head and looked at him. She was quiet for long enough that he could feel his own heartbeat. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But I know that I've been more myself in 6 weeks of knowing you than I've been in the last several years of doing what I do, and I know that's not a thing I'm willing to ride away from without at least naming it. I'm not a woman who follows a man," she said. "Not because I couldn't or wouldn't, but because I won't follow anywhere. I'll walk alongside or not at all." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to follow. I'm asking if there's a direction we could both walk." Sarah looked back out at the mountains. She was running the load-bearing calculation again, he could tell, measuring the structural integrity of what he was offering. "I have 3 commissions pending," she said finally. "The sealing of the tunnel, a granary commission in the next county, and the courthouse renovation in Hartley that I've been wanting for years. I have a report to file in Denver and a hearing to attend in Cheyenne in December," he said. "After that, my posting is not fixed. You'd consider staying in Wyoming territory." "I'd consider a great many things," he said, "that being the most appealing." She turned to look at him again, and the careful professional expression had softened into something that was still very much Sarah, still clear-eyed and direct, but warmer, as if a lantern had been brought closer. "I'm not easy," she said. "Ask anyone in this town. I'm exacting and I'm stubborn, and I have very specific views about mortar consistency." "I'm relentless," he said. "Ask anyone in 3 territories. I don't stop once I start." "That might be a problem," she said. "Or not," he said. And Sarah Ellsworth, who had built her walls with the same precision she brought to everything, let one thing through. She leaned over and kissed him, brief and certain, the way she made all her decisions, knowing the material, knowing the structure, deciding to trust it. Oliver felt the world rearrange itself into a different configuration. Not worse, he thought. Considerably better. He kissed her back with more warmth and less brevity, and the scaffold swayed slightly in the morning wind, and neither of them minded. Oliver rode to Denver in November, filed his report, gave his testimony to the federal prosecutor's office, and attended the preliminary hearing in Cheyenne in December, where Gerald Holt's arraignment went forward on all charges. The evidence was, as the prosecutor had said, exceptionally clean. Holt's lawyers were expensive and practiced, and they found absolutely nothing to work with. Holt himself sat at the defendant's table and looked across the courtroom at Oliver with the expression of a man who had calculated everything, and only miscalculated one thing, which was the woman. Oliver thought he could have told him, if he'd asked, that that particular miscalculation was easy to make from the outside, and completely incomprehensible once you actually knew her. The Callow brothers' trial was scheduled for the following spring, and Oliver's testimony would be required there too, which meant his presence in Wyoming territory was officially necessary through at least the summer of 1882. He noted this fact in a letter to his brother in Colorado Springs, and received in response a reply that was brief and whose brevity contained a great deal of wry amusement that Oliver chose not to examine too closely. He arrived back in Redemption Creek the week before Christmas with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard, and found that Sarah was doing exactly what she'd said she would, sealing the passage. He watched her work. He had been unable to fully appreciate it the first time he'd seen her because he'd been asking questions and gathering information. But now, he stood at the entrance to the bank cellar and simply watched, and what he saw was something that he thought about afterward as one of the most impressive things he had ever witnessed in his life. She was not just filling in the passage. She was restoring the wall to what it had been before the trigger was ever installed, removing the mechanism, repositioning the stone, remortaring, checking the level, correcting, building back. Each movement was precise and economical, no wasted motion, no uncertainty. The chisel and the trowel used with a fluency that made it look simple, which Oliver knew by now was the most misleading thing about real expertise. She was singing quietly to herself while she worked, a hymn he half recognized, and she hadn't heard him come down. He stood there for a long time. When she finally turned and found him there, she didn't startle, just looked at him with those clear dark eyes, his name on her face before she said a word. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he said. The space between them was maybe 10 feet of stone cellar and the smell of fresh mortar, and it closed quickly. The Christmas season in Redemption Creek was modest by Eastern standards, but genuine in its own way. The Reverend held services, the saloon held its own version of services, and the general store put up a garland of pine boughs that smelled green and cold every time the door opened. Oliver spent Christmas Day at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house eating roast chicken and dried apple pie, with Sarah across the table and Emmett Briggs to his left, and the Reverend at the head, because Mrs. Calloway collected strays with unconscious charity. After dinner, Oliver and Sarah walked along the creek in the early dark, the snow blue-white under a clear sky full of stars, and he told her about the trial preparations, and she told him about the Granary Commission and the fact that young Thomas Ray's, her apprentice, had just completed his first solo stone arch. "Did it hold?" Oliver asked. "Perfectly," she said, with the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has successfully transmitted something real. "He's got a gift. A natural understanding of load distribution. I told him so. Does he know how rare that is?" "He's beginning to," she said. "He's 19 and he thinks he knows a great deal, and he's going to discover over the next several years that he knows much less than he thinks, but that the things he genuinely knows are worth more than most people's entire repertoire." She paused. "It's a good position to be in, actually. The beginning of real learning." Oliver thought about what it had been like to be 19 and beginning to understand what he actually knew about the world. He thought about the war, about riding into his first engagement, about the specific education of surviving things that were designed to kill you. "You're a good teacher," he said. "I'm an exacting teacher," she said. "Which is not always the same thing, but I try to make it so." They stopped at the creek's edge. The water moved black and silver under the ice along its banks. The mountains were white shoulders against the starred sky. "I'd like to court you properly," Oliver said, looking at the water, "if you'll permit it, formally, whatever that means to you." Sarah was quiet beside him. Then she made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, warm and surprised. "Formally," she said. "I realize you may have specific views on the subject," he said, "possibly involving the structural requirements for a stable courtship or something equally precise." The laugh escaped more fully. "I appreciate precision in most things," she said. "In this particular thing I might be willing to accept something less rigidly measured." He turned and looked at her in the starlight, her face tipped up toward him, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Then let me be imprecise," he said. "I want to know you for a long time. I want to watch you work and argue with you about things and sit with you in the mornings when neither of us has to say anything. And I want to be the person you tell things to, the things you've been telling only yourself because there wasn't anyone else. I want all of it." Sarah Ellsworth, who had built her independence stone by stone, block by block, year by careful year, and whose independence was real and hard won, and not a thing she would ever surrender, looked at Oliver Maddox in the Wyoming winter and said, yes. Not because she needed him, because she wanted him, which was entirely different and entirely better. The courtship, as it developed through the winter and into the spring of 1882, was shaped by their natures, and therefore was somewhat unconventional by Redemption Creek's developing standards. There were Sunday walks and dinners at Mrs. Calloway's and evenings by the fire with books, Sarah reading engineering texts and Oliver reading case law, occasionally reading aloud to each other in the lamplight. There were arguments, real ones, about practical matters and philosophical ones, conducted with the bracing honesty of people who had both spent enough time alone to have developed genuine opinions about most things. One argument in particular became something they would tell later with laughter that neither of them quite managed to suppress. Oliver had suggested, in what he had believed to be a reasonable and well-intentioned tone, that the Granary Commission in the next county was perhaps a project Sarah could delegate to Thomas Ray's, given that the winter travel was difficult and the roads uncertain. Sarah had looked at him for a long, very still moment. "I need to understand something," she had said, in a voice that was perfectly level and therefore somewhat alarming. "Are you suggesting that I should not do my work because the weather is inconvenient?" Oliver had realized, about one syllable into his next sentence, that he had made a significant error in phrasing. "I'm suggesting that the roads are genuinely dangerous in February," he said, recalibrating. "They are," she agreed. "Which is why I've arranged to travel with the freight convoy that goes out on the 15th, which has 6 men and a covered wagon, and will make the journey considerably more safely than any individual traveler. I've been managing difficult logistics for 5 years, Oliver. I've not been waiting for someone to point out that February is cold." "I know that," he said, and then stopped and took a breath. "I know that. I'm sorry. I'm accustomed to managing risks for other people, and I applied that to you, which was wrong." She looked at him. "Why was it wrong?" "Because you've been managing your own risks since before I arrived, and you do it thoughtfully, and you didn't ask for my management." The tension in the room adjusted. "That's right," she said. "What I do value is someone telling me when they're worried. That's different from someone telling me what I should do." "Then I'm worried," he said plainly. "About the roads, about February, about you being 40 miles away." "The last one is noted," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "And not unwelcome." She came back from the Granary Commission 12 days later, the project assessed, and the commission agreed upon, with a technical solution to the foundation problem. She'd found on site that she explained to Oliver over supper with the brightness of someone who had solved something genuinely satisfying. He listened to all of it, asked the questions that occurred to him, and found that the combination of her expertise and her pleasure in it was one of the most compelling things he had ever encountered in another person. "What?" she said, catching the way he was looking at her. "I like watching you think," he said. She made the noise that was almost a laugh. "That's an odd thing to find attractive." "It's the most attractive thing I've ever encountered," he said with no qualification, and she looked at him with that directness that meant she was taking the measure of something. "You mean that?" she said. "Completely." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and for a while they just sat like that in the lamplight. The trial of the Callow brothers came in April, held in the Cheyenne Federal Courthouse. Oliver testified for 2 days, precise and detailed, following the evidence chain through from the original intelligence to the arrests, with the thoroughness that the prosecutor had built the case around. Sarah, as a material witness who had provided the original information and operated the tunnel mechanism, testified for one day. Oliver watched her on the stand with something close to awe. She was asked questions about the tunnel's construction, the trigger mechanism, her observations of the men moving through Holt's property, and she answered each one with crystalline precision, using technical language where it was appropriate and plain language where it was needed, anticipating the defense attorney's follow-up questions and structuring her answers to address them preemptively. The defense tried twice to rattle her with aggressive questioning about her qualifications, the implicit suggestion being that a woman's testimony about complex engineering should be given less weight. Sarah had fielded both attempts with the calm of someone who had been making precisely this argument for her entire career, and had won every time she had the floor long enough to make it. "I have been working stone professionally for 11 years, she said, to the second such challenge, with the courteous precision of someone explaining something to a person of limited understanding. "I was trained by Eli Ellsworth of Pittsburgh, regarded as one of the finest masons in Pennsylvania, and I have completed over 40 commissions in that time, including the first permanent stone courthouse in Laramie County. The mechanism I designed and built in this case is based on principles of counterweight and leverage that I can explain in detail if the court would like to spend the time. The trigger activation I have described operates on exactly the same principles and with exactly the same certainty as every other aspect of my craft. I designed it, I built it, I activated it in the presence of Deputy Marshal Maddox, who can confirm everything I have stated." The courtroom had been quiet for a moment after that. Oliver had seen the judge make a small note. The Callow brothers were convicted on all major charges. Gerald Holt's separate trial followed in June, and his conviction was if anything more complete, given the financial documentation that the federal prosecutor's office had assembled to complement the physical evidence from the tunnel. Holt was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary. When the verdict was read, Oliver watched Holt's face and saw the calculation there go still, like a clock that had run down. They were walking out of the courthouse afterward into the Cheyenne afternoon when Oliver stopped on the steps and turned to Sarah. "Marry me," he said. Sarah stopped one step below him, which put their eyes at almost exactly the same level. She looked at him with an expression that was very careful and very alive. "That's not a question," she observed. "No," he admitted. "I meant it as one, but it came out as a declaration, which is probably more honest." "You could rephrase it," she offered. "Would you marry me, Sarah Ellsworth?" He said, and it was a question this time, one he felt with remarkable intensity in his chest, in the space where professional certainty usually lived but which right now was occupied entirely by something that felt nothing like certainty and everything like hope. "Under what terms?" she said, and he could see the smile she was not quite letting happen. "Your work continues," he said. "Your name continues. Your independence continues. I want a partner, not a possession. I want to walk alongside, as previously discussed." "And your work?" she asked. "I've been offered a permanent posting as marshal for Redemption Creek and the surrounding territories," he said. The federal office was impressed with how the Holt case developed. "I'd be based in town, stable, not riding 3 territory circuits." She was quiet for a moment. "You took the posting before proposing," she said. "I took it last week," he said, "because it was the right professional decision regardless of your answer. But I want you to know that if you had said no, I would still have stayed because Redemption Creek is where I want to build something, one way or another." "You took it for you," she said slowly, working through it. "Not for me." "Yes, that's the right answer," she said. "I know," he said with a small, private satisfaction. Sarah Ellsworth, stonemason, contractor, woman who had crossed half a continent to build something real, looked at the man on the step above her and thought about foundations, about what it meant for something to be genuinely load-bearing, to be the kind of structure that did not require constant shoring, that held its own weight and distributed the rest evenly, that was made of material honest enough to last. "Yes," she said. "Under those terms, yes." He came down one step so they were level again, and he kissed her in the Cheyenne afternoon, with the federal courthouse behind them and the Wyoming sky enormous above. And when they separated, there were several federal court employees on the steps who began to disperse with the urgent busyness of people who had absolutely not been watching. They were married in October, almost exactly a year from when Oliver had first ridden into Redemption Creek and stopped his horse in the street. The ceremony was held in the church, whose stone foundation Sarah had rebuilt the previous spring as a charitable commission, which she had thought was appropriate, and which the Reverend had found deeply touching and slightly ironic given the circumstances. Mrs. Calloway wept throughout and claimed afterward that she absolutely had not. Emmett Briggs attended in a suit that had last been worn at his own wedding 15 years ago and fit him only approximately, and he shook Oliver's hand with the firm approval of a man who had privately hoped this would happen since approximately the third week. Thomas Rays stood with the other guests and looked at his employer with the complicated pride of someone who understood that the person they admired most had found someone equally deserving of admiration. The wedding supper at the boarding house lasted until well past midnight because everyone had things to say, and the apple brandy that the saloon keeper had contributed was very good. And Oliver made a speech that was shorter and more direct than any wedding speech Redemption Creek had heard, and that made Sarah laugh and also, briefly, press her face against his shoulder in a way that she would have considered unseemly in any other moment. They made their home in the house at the edge of town that had been the Holt residence, which the county had seized as partial restitution, and which Oliver had purchased at the public auction with money saved over many years of federal service. Sarah had specific and technical opinions about renovations, some of which Oliver agreed with, and some of which precipitated the second great argument, and all of which were eventually carried out because Sarah's structural reasoning was, in every case, correct. They dismantled the tunnel entrance in the house cellar together, which took 3 days, Sarah directing and Oliver doing a significant amount of the physical labor while taking careful instruction. They replaced the alcove wall with solid limestone that Sarah cut and laid herself, and when it was done, she stood back and looked at it with the look he knew by now, and he stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders and felt the same thing she felt, which was the rightness of something made true. The courthouse renovation in Hartley, which Sarah had wanted for years, was commissioned in the spring of 1883 and became one of the projects she was proudest of for the rest of her life. The building's facade required carved limestone work of considerable intricacy, and Thomas Rays worked alongside her on it, and the experience of teaching someone who was talented enough to push back on her decisions with his own well-reasoned arguments was something she described to Oliver as deeply satisfying. "It means he's ready," Oliver said, one evening while she was drawing plans for the upper cornice. "Nearly," she said. "He still defers when he shouldn't. But he's learning to trust his eye. Like someone I know," Oliver said. She looked up from her drawings. "I have always trusted my eye." "You trusted it about me," he said, "but you took your time." "Good measurements take time," she said, and went back to her drawings, and he smiled at the top of her bent head. Their first child was born in January of 1884, a son they named Eli, for Sarah's father, which Oliver had suggested before she had fully formed the thought, and which told her something important about how well he had been listening to her stories of the man who had taught her everything she knew about stone. Eli came into the world with a great deal of noise and very definite opinions, and from almost the beginning seemed particularly interested in watching his mother work, something that Mrs. Calloway, who had appointed herself auxiliary grandmother, said was clearly a sign of good sense. Oliver was present for the birth, which was not the universal custom, and held Sarah's hand through it with the same focused attention he gave everything. And when Eli arrived, Sarah watched the expression on Oliver's face and thought that whatever load-bearing she had found in this man, whatever capacity for carrying real weight, she had not measured quite deeply enough. He was better than even her careful assessment had anticipated, and she was a woman who appreciated being wrong in that direction. Redemption Creek grew through the 80s, as Wyoming territory pushed toward statehood, which would come in 1890. New people arrived, new buildings went up, and a disproportionate number of the permanent stone structures were Sarah Ellsworth Maddox's work, a name she had chosen to combine with a hyphen and a clear statement to the new sign painter about how it was to appear on her business papers. The courthouse records of Redemption Creek showed more commissions under her name than any other contractor in the county, and a column in the Cheyenne newspaper in 1887 about the development of permanent architecture in Wyoming territory mentioned her by name in terms that would have satisfied even the Pittsburgh man who had stolen her commission, if he had been the kind of man capable of satisfaction on another person's behalf, which he was not. Oliver's tenure as marshal was marked by the particular steadiness that had always characterized him. He was not a man who sought trouble, which was one of the things that made him effective at his work. He managed the territory's growth, the arrival of more settlers, the complications of the railroad expansion, the ongoing negotiation between new towns and existing communities that was always fraught and sometimes violent, with a patience that was not passivity. He understood that the law on the frontier was a construction, the same as a building, only as strong as what it was made of and how carefully it was laid. He and Sarah talked about this. They talked about most things, in the evenings after Eli was asleep and later after their second child, a daughter they named Me, arrived in 1886 and complicated the sleeping schedule considerably. They talked about the territory, about justice, about the ways in which the frontier's promise of new ground was real for some people and a fiction for others, about what it meant to build something that was supposed to hold. Sarah had by 1887 taken on a second apprentice, a young woman named Clara Foster who had come to her with self-taught skills and an expression that Sarah recognized from her own past, the specific set of someone who expects to be told they cannot do something. Sarah had assessed Clara's work, which was rough but showed genuine spatial understanding, and had offered her a place the same way she would have offered it to any equally talented man, with the matter-of-fact practicality that was her standard approach to most things. Oliver watched Clara develop over the following months with the same interest he'd brought to watching Thomas raise, and one evening told Sarah that he thought she might have chosen teaching as her second vocation if stonemasonry had not claimed her first. "They're not separate," Sarah said. "Building something that lasts requires passing it on, otherwise you've just made an object." Oliver thought about that for a long time after. He thought about it in terms of his own work, about what it meant to enforce a law in ways that built something versus ways that merely established temporary order. He changed some things about how he trained the deputies who served under him. More explanation, more reasoning, fewer flat commands. He was not sure it was the most efficient approach in every situation, but he thought it was more durable. He thought about mortar and about load-bearing. In 1889, as Wyoming territory prepared for statehood, Sarah was commissioned to do the decorative stonework on the new territorial government building in Cheyenne, a commission of such prestige that it effectively ended any remaining discussion about her position in the professional hierarchy of the territory's builders. She took Thomas Rays and Clara Foster and set up a temporary workshop in Cheyenne for the 6 months the project required, and Oliver managed the extended separation with the slightly strained patience of a man who had fully committed to the walking alongside principle, and found it more challenging in practice when the walking was 6 months and 100 miles. He visited twice, staying at the hotel near the government quarter, and watching Sarah work on the Cheyenne building was something he thought about for years afterward. The scale of it was unlike anything she'd done before. The carved stone details on the facade of a building meant to represent a new state's ambition, and she worked on it with the same focus she'd brought to the Redemption Creek bank cornice, and the same precision she'd brought to sealing the tunnel. Because for Sarah, there was no project too small or too large for the same quality of attention. He stood below the scaffold one late afternoon and watched her set a carved limestone panel with Thomas Ray's beside her, the two of them communicating in the shorthand of people who had worked closely for years, and he felt something expand in his chest that was not quite pride, because pride implied ownership, and he understood clearly that what she did belonged entirely to her. But that was adjacent to pride, something like the feeling of being in the presence of something genuinely excellent. She looked down and found him there, the way she always seemed to find him, with that immediate, direct awareness that had characterized her from the beginning. "You're early," she called down. "I finished what I needed to finish," he called back. "Can you come down?" "20 minutes," she said. "I need to finish this section." He sat on a stone block at the base of the scaffold and waited, and the 20 minutes were 20 minutes well spent, watching the panel go in and the level checked and the mortar tooled. And when she came down and stood beside him in the cooling afternoon air, he handed her the sandwich from the hotel kitchen that he'd brought wrapped in cloth, and she ate it standing up and talked about the panel and the challenges of the Cheyenne limestone versus what she was used to working with, and he listened to all of it. Wyoming became a state on July 10, 1890, the 44th state to join the Union, and notably the first state in the Union to have had women's suffrage in its territorial constitution, a fact that Oliver noted to Sarah over their Independence Day supper with the care of someone making a meaningful observation. "It's a start," Sarah said, with the pragmatic satisfaction of someone who did not mistake beginnings for endings, but recognized them as genuinely significant. "A state where you can vote," he said. "A state where I've built things," she said, "including the building where they'll count the votes." He raised his glass. She raised hers. In 1892, Eli Maddox was 8 years old and had developed what Sarah assessed as genuine spatial intelligence, a capacity for looking at structures and understanding their load dynamics that she found both professionally recognizable and personally touching. She had not pushed it, had not made any particular effort to cultivate it, had simply allowed her son to spend time watching her work when he wished to, which was often, and had answered his questions with the same honest precision she brought to everything. Oliver watched their son follow Sarah around a work site one Saturday morning and felt a fullness in his chest that he thought was probably what most people meant when they talked about happiness, though the word seemed inadequate to the specific texture of the feeling, which was more like the satisfaction of something built right, something that would hold through seasons and weather, something that did not require constant reassurance of its own solidity. Me, at 6, showed every sign of inheriting her father's particular brand of quiet observation, a willingness to sit and watch long enough to understand something rather than moving toward it immediately. She was also, Oliver noted with private amusement, developing her mother's precise and absolute standards about accuracy, refusing to accept approximate answers in a way that was already causing some friction with the schoolteacher, who was otherwise an excellent woman. They had a third child in 1893, another son, whom they named James, for no family reason but because they had both separately thought of the name and said it on the same morning, which they took as sufficient reason. The tunnel, sealed and solid now, existed only in the record Oliver had filed with the federal courts and in Sarah's memory and in his. Holt had served his time and was released in 1896, a diminished man who, by all reports that eventually reached Redemption Creek, had relocated to California and was living quietly. The Callow brothers had served their sentences in stages, Ramai's early release for cooperation having come first, and no one in Redemption Creek thought much about them anymore. They were settled history, the kind that shaped a place without being its ongoing story. The ongoing story was Redemption Creek growing and changing, the cattle business shifting as the open range closed, the arrival of the railroad spur that Oliver had worked hard to bring through the territory, the new school building that replaced the original soddy structure, the permanent hospital that Doc Pemberton had campaigned for through a decade of territorial politics, and the growing collection of stone buildings, courthouses and banks and granaries and churches that bore Sarah's craft in their walls. One evening in the summer of 1896, Oliver and Sarah sat on the porch of their house at the edge of town, the mountains burning orange with the sunset behind the peaks, Eli reading on the steps, me and James having been persuaded to bed with the usual negotiation, and the particular quality of summer evening in the high country settled over everything. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, in the tone that meant she had been thinking for a while and was ready to say what she'd thought. "Tell me," Oliver said. "Clara Foster has been offered a partnership in a firm in Denver," she said. "A proper architectural firm, not just a contracting operation. They want someone who can design as well as build." She paused. "I told her to take it. Did she want your opinion?" "She wanted my blessing," Sarah said with a small smile, "which is different, but I gave both." "Good," Oliver said. "Thomas is ready to run the business here independently," she continued. "He's been doing it substantially on his own for the last 2 years. What I mainly contribute now is the specialized work, the detail work, the complex mechanisms. He doesn't need me to manage the daily operations. What are you planning?" Oliver asked, because he knew her well enough to know that she had something specific in mind, and that the context setting he just received was her version of a foundation pour. "I've been approached by the State Architectural Board," she said. "They're developing a standards committee for public building construction in Wyoming. They want people who have built the buildings, not just people who have planned them from offices. They want me to serve as the technical advisor." Oliver was quiet for a moment, taking that in. The shape of it, the scale of it, what it would mean for how she spent her time and where her expertise would go, the specific kind of mark it would leave. "It would mean work that outlasts any individual building," he said. "Yes," she said. "Standards, methods, documentation. Things that the next generation of builders will use without knowing where they came from maybe, but use correctly." "You've been teaching since Thomas," he said. "This is just teaching at a larger scale." "Yes," she said again. "I think that's what it is." He reached over and took her hand, which was still rough and dry and strong from years of work, and held it in both of his. "Take it," he said. She turned to look at him in the evening light. "You didn't ask where the committee meets or how often." "Cheyenne, I assume. Once a month, maybe more in the beginning." "Yes," she said. "Then I'll manage," he said. "And when I can, I'll come." "I'm not asking you to manage," she said, echoing his old phrasing back at him with the quiet amusement of years. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering to manage. I'm telling you that the house and the children and the work here will all be here when you come back from making things better for every builder in Wyoming, and that I'll be here and that none of it is going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment. This man with gray at his temples now, and the lines of weather and watchfulness at the corners of his eyes and the hands that were still strong, and she thought about measurements, about all the ways she'd assessed the load-bearing of things in her life, the rock and the man and the work and the love, and found this to be the most durably accurate assessment she had ever made. "You're a very good structure," she said. "You built me," he said, "significantly. I may have made some improvements," she allowed. "Considerable improvements," he said. Eli looked up from his book on the steps. "Are you two being strange again?" he asked with the resigned affection of an 8-year-old who had accepted this as a standard feature of his parents. "Yes," they said together. Sarah accepted the committee appointment and traveled to Cheyenne once a month through the autumn, returning each time with technical arguments and interesting problems, and a brightness that Oliver associated with her at her most herself, engaged and specific and moving toward something real. The standards she helped develop for public building construction in Wyoming were adopted formally in 1898 and referenced by builders in the territory and beyond for the next several decades. Oliver served as Marshal of Redemption Creek for 19 years in total, through statehood and the turn of the century and the years after, through the changing face of the territory and the changing nature of the law's work. He retired in 1903, when he was 57, and the frontier, as it had been, was already a memory beginning to be organized into legend. And he did it with the satisfaction of someone who had built something that would hold on its own. They held a supper at the hotel for his retirement, which had by then replaced the boarding house as the town's social center, though Mrs. Calloway, who was 70 and still formidable, attended and insisted on sitting next to Sarah, and told stories about the corner table and the two plates that still made Sarah press her face briefly against Oliver's shoulder. Thomas Reyes, who was 41 and who ran the most respected masonry operation in the county, gave the toast, and he spoke about law and stone in a way that made it clear he had spent years around a woman who thought in terms of foundations, and that the thinking had taken. In the last years of the decade, as the new century established itself, and the world grew complicated in new ways that Oliver watched with the attention of a man who had seen several worlds change already, Sarah and Oliver sat often on that same porch where they had been sitting in the summer of '96, with the mountains going through their colors behind the peaks, and they talked about Eli, who was 25 and had become a civil engineer in Denver with his mother's spatial intelligence and his father's methodical patience, and who sent letters full of technical detail that Oliver read carefully and Sarah read with the professional eye of someone checking his work. About me, who had married a newspaper editor in Laramie and was writing her own columns in a way that suggested the quiet observation had been building to something for years. About James, who was still finding his direction at 17 in the way that youngest children often did, with the luxury of having been watched over by siblings who had absorbed the first experiments. About themselves, too, which they did with the comfort of people who had been having the same conversation for 20 years and had not yet exhausted it. "What would you have done?" Oliver said one evening, in the way of old conversation games, "if I'd been the kind of man who told you what to do?" "Left," Sarah said immediately, very politely and very completely. "And if I'd been impressed by the work but not by the person doing it," she thought about that one, "the same thing but with less politeness. And if I'd been frightened of you," he asked. "Some men were." "I know," she said, not without a certain satisfaction. "Those were not my men." "What made me your man?" he asked, and there was real curiosity in it, even after all this time, the willingness to learn the answer even if you thought you knew it. She was quiet for a moment, the sunset going deep orange above the mountains. "You stopped your horse," she said finally, "the first morning. You were in the middle of the main street of a town you'd never been to with a job to do, and you stopped your horse to watch someone work, because the work was interesting." She paused. "That was before you knew anything about me. You were just watching craftsmanship because it was worth watching, and I thought there is a man who respects the thing itself." Oliver was quiet. "That was all," he said. "That was the beginning," she corrected. "Everything after was confirmation." He reached over, as he had done 1,000 times in 20 years, and took her hand. And they sat in the deepening evening and watched the stars come up over the mountains, the same stars that had been there when they walked along the creek that first October, and he had told her he wanted all of it, the working and the arguing and the mornings, and she had said yes under those terms. The terms had held. The structure had held. The thing they had built together, which was not made of stone but was held together by many of the same principles, by honest material and careful attention, and the willingness to correct what needed correcting without destroying what was sound, had held through 20 years and would hold for 20 more. Redemption Creek had a street named Ellsworth Avenue by the turn of the century, for the buildings that lined it, and the county seal bore in its border the image of the courthouse whose renovation Sarah had designed in 1883, a detail that Sarah mentioned to Oliver once and never again, because she was not a person who needed to mention things like that, only to know them. Oliver knew them too. He knew every building she had built in those 20 years, their names and dates and technical challenges, the same way he knew the cases he had tried, and the men he had brought to justice, as the essential record of what a life had been made of. What a life had been made of for both of them was this: honesty about what was there, patience to look at it long enough, the courage to build with material that was real rather than material that was convenient, and someone beside you who looked at the same things and saw them truly, whose hand in yours was the most reliable measurement you had ever taken. The mountains were still there. The creek still ran. And in the house at the edge of Redemption Creek, in the fall of 1909, two people who had found each other in the particular and unrepeatable way that real things are found, by honest work and careful looking and the willingness to trust what held, sat together in the evening light and were, without qualification, at home.